He bought a broken tractor for just $10, thinking he'd gotten the deal of a lifetime. But when he finally got it running, what it revealed would shake his understanding of everything he thought he knew about faith, destiny, and the divine hand that guides us all. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The autumn wind swept across the golden fields of Nebraska, carrying with it the scent of harvest and the promise of winter. Thomas Bennett stood at the edge of his property, looking out over the 40 acres that had been in his family for 3 generations. At 52 years old, his hands were calloused from decades of work, his face weathered by sun and disappointment. The farm that had once thrived under his father's care now barely produced enough to cover the mortgage. His wife had left 2 years ago, taking their daughter to the city where life seemed easier, where dreams didn't depend on rain that never came or crops that withered before they could grow. The divorce papers still sat in a drawer, unsigned, as if refusing to acknowledge them might somehow undo the loneliness that filled every corner of the empty farmhouse. Thomas walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on the dry grass. Inside, his old John Deere sat silent, its engine dead for the 3rd time this season. The repair costs alone would set him back a month's income, money he simply didn't have. He'd been making do with borrowed equipment from his neighbor, but charity wore thin after a while, and he could see the pity in people's eyes when they looked at him. He was a man watching his legacy crumble, and there wasn't a thing he could do to stop it. That morning, while drinking his coffee in the kitchen that felt too large for one person, he'd seen a classified ad in the local paper. Estate sale, farm equipment, tools, various machinery. The address was for the old Patterson place, 20 miles east, where Malcolm Patterson had lived alone for 40 years before passing away the previous month. Thomas had met him once or twice at the feed store, a quiet man with kind eyes who always seemed to be thinking about something far away. The sale was set for Saturday, and though Thomas had little money to spare, he decided to go. Maybe he'd find a part for his tractor or a tool he could use. Maybe he just needed to be around people for a few hours, to remember what it felt like to be part of a community, instead of a man standing alone on a dying farm. When Saturday came, he drove his pickup down the winding country roads, past fields that belonged to larger operations now, corporate farms that had swallowed up the small family plots one by one. The Patterson place sat at the end of a long gravel driveway, a modest white farmhouse with a barn that leaned slightly to the left. Cars and trucks were already parked in the yard, and people moved among the scattered items like scavengers picking through the remains of a life. Thomas walked slowly through the collection of tools, furniture, and forgotten things. There were handsaws and oil lamps, boxes of books with yellowed pages, and a collection of vinyl records that someone was flipping through with mild interest. Near the back of the property, partially hidden behind a rusted grain silo, he found it. A small tractor, old and battered, its red paint faded to a dull orange by decades of sun and neglect. One of the rear tires was flat. The seat was torn, and the engine looked like it hadn't turned over in years. But something about it caught his attention. Maybe it was the way the morning light hit the metal, or maybe it was just the desperate hope that he could fix something, anything, in his life. He walked closer, running his hand along the hood. The model was a Farmall Cub from the 1950s, a compact machine that farmers once used for small jobs and tight spaces. His grandfather had owned one just like it. A woman with a clipboard approached, smiling the professional smile of someone running an estate sale. "That old thing's been sitting there for at least 30 years, she said. "Malcolm never got rid of anything. Sentimental, I suppose." Thomas asked how much she wanted for it. She looked at the tractor, then at him, and shrugged. "It doesn't run, and honestly, we just want it gone. How about $10? He almost laughed. $10 for a tractor, even a broken one, seemed impossible, but he pulled a crumpled bill from his wallet and handed it to her. She wrote him a receipt, wished him luck, and walked away to help another customer. Thomas stood there for a moment, looking at his purchase, wondering if he'd just made the smartest decision of his life or the most foolish. Getting it home took the better part of the afternoon. He borrowed a trailer from the same neighbor who'd been lending him equipment, and together they winched the little tractor onto the bed. It was heavier than it looked, solid and stubborn, refusing to cooperate even in its broken state. By the time they got it unloaded in Thomas's barn, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. His neighbor looked at the tractor, shook his head with a grin and said, "Well, Tom, you've always had a gift for finding projects. Good luck with that one." When he was alone, Thomas circled the machine slowly, assessing the damage. The carburetor was clogged, the battery was long dead, and the fuel lines had cracked with age. But the frame was solid, and the engine, though seized, looked salvageable. He decided he'd work on it in the evenings, after the day's chores were done. It would give him something to focus on, something other than the silence of the house and the weight of his failures. That night, he sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Nebraska sky. The wind had died down, and the world felt still, almost expectant. He thought about his daughter, about how she used to ride on his lap when he drove the old John Deere through the fields, her laughter bright and pure. He wondered if she ever thought about those days, or if the city had already erased them from her memory. He finished his drink, went inside, and fell asleep in the chair by the window, dreaming of engines that wouldn't start and prayers that went unanswered. The next morning, Thomas woke with a stiffness in his neck and a renewed sense of purpose. The little tractor sat in the barn like a challenge, and for the first time in months, he felt something other than defeat. He made himself breakfast, eggs and toast that he ate standing at the counter, then walked out into the cool morning air. The fields needed attention, fences needed mending, but his mind kept drifting back to that farmal cub. He decided the other work could wait a few hours. He gathered his tools, an old metal box his father had left him, filled with wrenches and screwdrivers, worn smooth by decades of use. He set up a workbench beside the tractor and began with the basics, draining the old fuel that had turned to varnish in the tank, removing the spark plugs that were crusted with carbon deposits. The work was methodical, almost meditative, and he lost himself in it the way he used to when he was younger, when fixing things felt like an act of faith rather than an exercise in futility. By afternoon he'd made progress. The fuel system was cleaned, new lines ordered from the parts store in town, and the carburetor soaking in a bath of solvent. As he worked, he noticed details he'd missed before. Someone had taken care of this machine once, really cared for it. Beneath the rust and grime, the welds were clean, the metalwork precise. There were scratches and dents that told stories of years in the field, but nothing that spoke of neglect. Malcolm Patterson had loved this tractor. That much was clear, even if he'd let it sit unused for 3 decades. Thomas wondered why. What had made a man who clearly valued his equipment simply stop using it? He wiped his hands on a rag and decided to take a break. The autumn sun was warm on his face as he walked to the house for water. When he returned, he noticed something odd about the tractor's undercarriage, a panel that didn't quite sit flush with the frame. He crouched down, running his fingers along the edge, and felt a seam that had been welded shut, then painted over. It wasn't original factory work. Someone had modified this machine, added something that wasn't supposed to be there. Curiosity gnawed at him. He fetched a pry bar and worked it carefully into the seam, not wanting to damage anything. The metal groaned, resisting at first, then suddenly gave way with a sharp crack. Behind the panel was a small compartment, roughly the size of a shoebox, lined with oilcloth. His heart began to pound as he reached inside. His fingers touched something hard and rectangular, wrapped in what felt like plastic. He pulled it out into the light and found himself holding a bundle wrapped in layers of thick, clear sheeting, the kind used to protect things from moisture and time. Through the plastic, he could see the edges of what looked like papers, old and yellowed. He carried the bundle to his workbench, his hands trembling slightly, and carefully cut through the layers of wrapping. Inside were documents, dozens of them, some typed on official letterhead, others handwritten in a careful sloping script. But it was the item at the very top that made him freeze. A leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with a simple cross, and the initials M.P. Malcolm Patterson. Thomas opened it slowly, almost reverently. The first page was dated April 15th, 1952, and the handwriting was the same he'd seen on some of the other documents. "Today I begin this record," it read, "not for myself, but for whoever finds it when I am gone. What I have discovered is too important to die with me, too profound to keep silent. If you are reading this, then God has guided your hands to this place, and you are meant to know what I know. Do not be afraid. What seems impossible is simply God showing us that his ways are higher than ours." Thomas felt a chill run through him, despite the warm afternoon. He turned the page and began to read. Malcolm Patterson's journal was unlike anything he'd ever encountered. It wasn't a farmer's diary of crops and weather, it was a chronicle of something else entirely, a systematic documentation of what Malcolm called divine patterns, moments where the hand of God became visible in the mathematical precision of the world around him. The entries began simply enough. Malcolm had been a deeply religious man, but also educated, with a background in engineering before he'd returned to farming. He'd started noticing peculiarities in his fields, patterns in the way crops grew, in the timing of rains, in the behavior of animals. At first, he'd dismissed them as coincidence, but over time, the patterns became impossible to ignore. He began documenting everything, measuring, calculating, comparing his observations to biblical texts and ancient prophecies. What he found, or what he believed he found, was evidence of divine mathematics, a hidden order beneath the chaos of nature that pointed to intelligent design on a scale that defied natural explanation. Thomas read page after page, his coffee growing cold beside him. Malcolm had documented crop circles that appeared in his fields decades before they became famous, formations so precise they could only be seen from the air, which he'd climbed a water tower to photograph. He'd recorded instances of healing, animals that should have died from injury or illness recovering overnight in ways that veterinarians couldn't explain. He'd charted weather patterns that defied meteorological prediction, storms that split around his property as if guided by an unseen hand, but it was the mathematical formulas that truly unsettled Thomas. Page after page of equations, complex calculations that Malcolm claimed proved the existence of what he called God's algorithm, a mathematical constant that appeared in everything from the spiral of a sunflower to the orbit of planets, from the structure of DNA to the frequency of prayer. Malcolm had devoted 30 years to this research, working in secret, knowing that the world would call him crazy. The journal entries grew more intense as the years progressed. Malcolm wrote about visions, about moments of clarity where he claimed to see the underlying code of creation. He wrote about skeptics who tried to disprove his findings and their eventual conversions when faced with evidence they couldn't refute. He wrote about scientists who'd visited his farm in secret, examining his data and leaving shaken. And then, in an entry dated 1982, Malcolm wrote about a decision. "I have hidden my life's work," the entry read, "because the world is not ready. Man seeks to understand God through science, but recoils when science points back to God. They will try to destroy this evidence, to explain it away, to silence anyone who dares suggest that the Creator's fingerprints are everywhere for those willing to see. So I have placed everything here, in the machine that helped me cultivate the very fields where these revelations occurred. Whoever finds it will find it when God wills it, not a moment before." Thomas set the journal down, his mind reeling. The sun had moved across the sky while he'd been reading, and shadows now stretched long across the barn floor. He looked at the stack of documents still waiting to be examined, photographs, charts, letters from people whose names he recognized, respected scientists and theologians. This wasn't the rambling of a madman. This was systematic, rigorous research conducted over decades. Whether it proved what Malcolm believed it proved, Thomas couldn't say. But one thing was certain: He'd stumbled onto something that someone had desperately wanted preserved, something that Malcolm Patterson had believed was important enough to hide away and wait for the right person to discover. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. What do you think Thomas should do with this discovery? Should he share it with the world or keep it hidden like Malcolm did? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and your perspective matters. Let's figure this out together. That evening, Thomas couldn't eat. He sat at the kitchen table with the journal open in front of him, a single lamp casting yellow light across the pages. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the porch. He'd brought all of Malcolm's documents inside, spread them across every available surface, trying to make sense of the magnitude of what he'd found. There were photographs of crop formations taken from the top of the water tower, each one accompanied by detailed measurements and astronomical data showing their alignment with celestial events. There were medical records, testimonies from 3 different veterinarians, documenting the impossible recovery of a horse that had been struck by lightning. Its heart stopped for over 4 minutes before it suddenly revived. There were weather logs spanning 40 years, showing precipitation patterns that formed what Malcolm claimed were biblical numbers when plotted on a graph. Thomas picked up one of the letters, this one written on university letterhead from a physics department at MIT. The letter was dated 1979 and addressed to Malcolm. "Dear Mr. Patterson," it read, "I have reviewed the data you sent, and I must confess that I am deeply troubled by what I have found. The mathematical constants you have identified appear in far too many natural phenomena to be coincidental. The probability calculations are staggering. However, I cannot in good conscience publish findings that would upend the foundational assumptions of my field. I have a career, a family, and a reputation to consider. I'm sure you understand. What you have discovered is either the most important scientific finding of the century, or we are both seeing patterns that don't exist. I choose to believe the latter for my own peace of mind. Please do not contact me again." The letter was signed by a name Thomas recognized, a physicist who'd won major awards and written textbooks. The man had seen Malcolm's evidence and chosen to walk away from it. How many others had done the same? Thomas stood and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. In the distance, he could see the lights of his neighbor's house, warm and ordinary. What was he supposed to do with this? If he came forward with Malcolm's research, he'd be laughed at, dismissed as another conspiracy theorist trying to prove the existence of God through pseudoscience. But if Malcolm was right, if even a fraction of what he documented was real, then this was evidence that the divine wasn't just a matter of faith, but of observable, measurable reality. He thought about his daughter, about the questions she used to ask when she was young. Why do birds know how to fly south? How do flowers know when to bloom? Who teaches the bees to make hexagons? He'd always given her the standard answers: instinct, evolution, natural selection. But what if there was another answer, one that science and faith had been too afraid to explore together? He returned to the table and picked up another document. This one a series of photographs showing the interior of a beehive. Malcolm had somehow captured images of the construction process, showing how bees created their honeycomb cells with mathematical precision that matched the golden ratio. Beneath the photos was a note in Malcolm's handwriting. The golden ratio, 1:618, appears in the Nautilus shell, the human face, the spiral galaxies, and the bee's architecture. This is not random. This is the signature of the Creator, written in mathematics that transcends culture, language, and time. It is God's universal language, and it has been speaking to us since the beginning. Thomas felt something shift inside him, a kind of awakening he couldn't quite name. He'd been raised Christian, went to church every Sunday as a boy, but somewhere along the way, faith had become routine, then obligation, then eventually just another thing he'd let slip away. When his wife left, when the farm started failing, he'd stopped praying because it felt like shouting into an empty room. But now, sitting surrounded by decades of careful documentation, he wondered if he'd been looking for answers in the wrong places. Maybe God didn't speak in thundering voices or burning bushes anymore. Maybe he spoke in patterns and numbers, in the elegant mathematics that held the universe together. The next morning, Thomas made a decision. He would continue Malcolm's work, not to prove anything to anyone else, but to understand it for himself. He spent the day finishing the repairs on the tractor, and by late afternoon, he was ready to try starting it. He'd replaced the battery, cleaned every component, and said a quiet prayer before turning the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life with a sound that echoed through the barn like a resurrection. He sat there on the torn seat, feeling the vibration of the machine beneath him, and smiled for the first time in months. Over the following weeks, Thomas dove deeper into Malcolm's research. He began his own observations, spending hours in the fields with a notebook, recording what he saw. He noticed things he'd never paid attention to before, the way the morning dew formed perfect geometric patterns on spider webs, the mathematical precision in the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower head, the Fibonacci sequence appearing in the branching of trees. He started photographing everything, measuring, calculating, adding his own notes to Malcolm's decades of work. And the more he observed, the more he became convinced that Malcolm had been onto something profound. One evening, as he was reviewing his notes, his phone rang. It was his daughter, Emily. They hadn't spoken in over a month, their conversations having dwindled to awkward, obligatory calls on holidays. "Hey, Dad," she said, her voice tentative. "Just calling to check in. How are you?" For the first time in years, he had something real to tell her. He began carefully, not wanting to sound crazy, telling her about the tractor he'd bought, about the journal he'd found, about the patterns he'd been observing. He expected her to brush it off, to change the subject, but instead, she grew quiet. "That's actually kind of beautiful," she said finally. "I'm in graduate school now, did I tell you? Studying environmental science. We talk about patterns in nature all the time, but nobody ever wants to discuss what it might mean, philosophically, I mean." They talked for over an hour, longer than they'd spoken in years. She told him about her studies, about how she'd been struggling with questions of meaning and purpose, in a field that seemed to reduce everything to chemical reactions and evolutionary biology. "It's like we're afraid to say that maybe there's something more," she said. "Maybe something guiding it all." When they hung up, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt since before the divorce: hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility that this discovery might actually matter, that it might help people see the world differently. He looked at the journal sitting on the table, at Malcolm's careful handwriting, documenting a lifetime of wonder and faith. The old farmer had been alone in his conviction, had died without anyone knowing what he'd discovered. But Thomas didn't have to be alone. He had a choice: to hide this away like Malcolm had, or to trust that maybe, just maybe, the world was finally ready for it. The next Sunday, Thomas did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He went to church. The small white building sat at the edge of town, its steeple rising against the autumn sky. He slipped into a back pew just as the service was starting, feeling out of place in his work clothes among the families in their Sunday best. The pastor, a young man named David Reed, spoke about faith in uncertain times, about trusting in things unseen. After the service, as people filed out into the sunshine, Thomas approached him. "Pastor Reed," he said, "I wonder if I could talk to you about something I found." They sat in the empty church, and Thomas told him everything. He showed him the journal, the photographs, some of the documents he'd brought along. He expected skepticism, maybe even concern for his mental state. Instead, Pastor Reed's eyes grew wide with something that looked like recognition. "I've been praying for something like this," the pastor said quietly. "For years, I've felt like we're losing people, because faith seems disconnected from reality, like you have to choose between believing in God or believing in science. But what if you don't? What if this is the bridge we've been waiting for? He asked if he could share some of Malcolm's findings with his congregation, carefully, respectfully, not as proof of God, but as an invitation to see the divine in the details of creation. Thomas agreed, and the following Sunday, Pastor Reed gave a sermon about patterns and purpose, about how the mathematical precision of the universe might be God's way of leaving us clues, reminding us that we're not accidents in a random cosmos. The response was unexpected. After the service, people approached Thomas, not with mockery, but with genuine curiosity. An elderly woman told him about her own experiences, unexplainable moments she'd always attributed to God's intervention. A high school science teacher asked to see Malcolm's mathematical formulas, his hands shaking as he studied them. A farmer mentioned similar patterns he'd noticed but never thought to document. Within days, word spread beyond the small church. Thomas received a call from a professor at the University of Nebraska who'd heard about Malcolm's research and wanted to examine it. Then came a journalist from a regional newspaper, then a documentary filmmaker. Some were skeptics, looking to debunk what they assumed was religious fantasy. Others were believers, hoping for validation. But everyone who saw the evidence, really saw it and studied it with an open mind, came away changed. Not converted necessarily, but unsettled in the best possible way, forced to confront the possibility that the universe was more intentional than they'd been taught to believe. Within a month, Thomas's quiet farm had become an unlikely pilgrimage site. People arrived from neighboring states, some driving hundreds of miles just to see Malcolm's research, to walk the fields where the patterns had been documented, to touch the tractor that had preserved this hidden knowledge for decades. Thomas set up a small display in his barn, carefully organizing the photographs and documents under glass, treating them with the reverence they deserved. He installed better lighting and arranged chairs for visitors who wanted to sit and read through Malcolm's journal entries. The little farmal cub sat at the center of it all, restored and running, a symbol of how broken things could be made whole again, how secrets buried in rust and silence could be brought back to life. Not everyone who came was friendly. A group of academics from a secular university arrived one afternoon, armed with cameras and recording equipment, determined to expose what they called agricultural mysticism as confirmation bias and coincidence. Thomas welcomed them anyway, showing them everything without reservation. They spent 3 days on the farm, measuring, photographing, running their own calculations. On the final day, their lead researcher, a woman named Dr. Patricia Hernandez, asked to speak with Thomas privately. They sat on the porch as the sun set over the fields, turning the sky into layers of gold and crimson. "I came here to debunk this," she said, her voice quiet and strained. "I thought it would be easy, but I can't explain what I've seen. The mathematical constants, the patterns, the documented anomalies, they're all real. They exist. Whether they prove the existence of God is beyond my expertise, but they prove something we haven't been willing to acknowledge. There's an order to nature that transcends evolutionary biology, something that looks deliberately designed." She paused, staring at her hands. "I've built my career on the assumption that the universe is essentially random, that complexity arises from chaos without guidance or purpose. But these patterns don't behave like random occurrences. They repeat with intentionality, and I don't know what to do with that." Thomas offered her coffee, and they talked late into the night. She told him about her own journey, how she'd been raised Catholic but abandoned faith in college when it seemed incompatible with scientific truth. She spoke about the loneliness of believing the universe was meaningless, that consciousness was just an accident, that when we died we simply ceased to exist. "I wanted that not to be true," she admitted, "but wanting something doesn't make it real. Evidence makes it real. And now I have evidence that suggests maybe, just maybe, I've been wrong about everything." Before she left the next morning, Dr. Hernandez asked for copies of Malcolm's mathematical formulas. "I can't promise anything," she said, But I have colleagues who need to see this, real scientists who won't dismiss it out of fear. Maybe we can start a conversation that should have happened decades ago. As word continued to spread, Thomas found himself in an unusual position. He was no theologian, no scientist, just a farmer who'd bought a broken tractor for $10. Yet people treated him like some kind of messenger, asking him questions about faith and meaning that he didn't feel qualified to answer. He tried to redirect them to Malcolm's work, to the evidence itself, but they wanted something more personal. They wanted to know what it meant to him, how it had changed his life. One evening, a young man named Marcus drove 8 hours from Kansas City to visit the farm. He was in his early 20s, thin and hollow-eyed, wearing the exhausted expression of someone who'd stopped sleeping well. He waited until all the other visitors had left before approaching Thomas. "I need to know if it's real," Marcus said, his voice breaking. "I need to know if any of this matters. I've been planning to kill myself, had the whole thing figured out, but then I saw an article about what you found here, and I thought maybe I should see it first, before I do anything permanent." Thomas felt his heart constrict. He led Marcus to a bench outside the barn, and they sat in the cooling evening air. "I can't tell you what to believe," Thomas said carefully. "I can only tell you what I've seen. I was in a dark place too when I found that tractor. My wife was gone, my farm was dying, and I felt like God had forgotten I existed. But Malcolm's work showed me something I'd missed. The divine isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's in the details, in the way seeds know how to become trees, in the way damaged hearts somehow keep beating. There's an intelligence woven into everything, and if that intelligence created all this, then it created you too, on purpose, with intention." Marcus wiped his eyes. "But what if I'm too broken? What if I've already destroyed everything good in my life?" Thomas thought about the tractor, about how rusted and useless it had seemed, how everyone at the estate sale had walked past it without a second glance. "Broken things can be restored," he said. "That's what I've learned. It takes time and effort, and you have to believe the work is worth doing. But nothing is beyond repair if you're willing to try." They talked for hours. Thomas shared his own struggles, his failures, the nights he'd sat alone wondering if life had any purpose. He showed Marcus the journal entry where Malcolm had written about despair, about a winter in 1967 when his crops had failed and he'd stood in an empty field, questioning whether God cared at all. "But then spring came," Malcolm had written, "and I watched as dead ground produced life again. I realized that death isn't the end of the story, it's just winter. And winter always gives way to spring." When Marcus finally left just before midnight, he shook Thomas's hand and said something that would stay with him forever. "I came here looking for proof of God. I think I found proof that I matter. That's enough." 3 weeks later, Thomas received a letter. Marcus had checked himself into a treatment facility, was working with counselors, and had reconnected with his family. "I'm not fixed," he wrote, "but I'm trying. And that tractor you bought for $10 might have saved my life. Thank you for not keeping it hidden." Stories like Marcus's became common. A woman who'd lost her child found comfort in Malcolm's observations about how nature itself seemed to grieve and heal in cycles. A pastor whose congregation had dwindled to a handful of elderly parishioners used the research to spark a revival of interest, filling his church with young people hungry for a faith that engaged both heart and mind. A researcher in quantum physics began publishing papers on the intersection of science and spirituality, citing Malcolm's work as inspiration. But not all the attention was positive. Thomas received threatening letters from militant atheists who accused him of peddling pseudoscience and exploiting vulnerable people. He got angry messages from religious fundamentalists who claimed that trying to prove God through mathematics was blasphemy, that faith required no evidence. One night, someone spray-painted "false prophet" across the side of his barn. He scrubbed it off the next morning, refusing to be intimidated. Through it all, the little Farmall cub kept running. Thomas would start it up each morning, letting it idle in the barn, while he organized Malcolm's documents and prepared for the day's visitors. The sound of that engine became a kind of meditation, a reminder that what had been silent and broken now lived again. His daughter Emily came to visit during her fall break, her first time back to the farm in over a year. She walked through the barn slowly, reading Malcolm's journal entries, studying the photographs and calculations. When she finished, she turned to her father with tears in her eyes. "Mom used to say you lived in the past, that you couldn't let go of the old ways," she said. "But this isn't about the past. This is about something eternal. Something that's always been true, just waiting for someone to notice." They spent the weekend together, father and daughter, talking about things they'd never discussed before. Faith, meaning the possibility that their lives were part of a larger story. Emily told him she'd been feeling lost in her graduate program, drowning in data that reduced the natural world to chemical formulas and survival mechanisms. "But Malcolm's work reminds me why I fell in love with nature in the first place," she said. "Because it's beautiful, because it's precise, because it feels like art, not accident." On Sunday morning, they drove to church together. Pastor Reed had asked Thomas to share his testimony, to tell the congregation about finding the tractor and what it had revealed. Thomas was nervous, his hands shaking as he stood at the pulpit, but when he looked out at the faces in the pews, old and young, skeptics and believers, he felt a calm settle over him. "I'm just a farmer," he began. "I don't have the education of the scientists who've studied this research, and I don't have the theological training of your pastor. But I know what it's like to feel forgotten, to wonder if God is real or if we're all just stumbling through a meaningless universe hoping for the best. And I can tell you what I've learned. God's not hiding. He's in plain sight, written into every leaf and star and heartbeat. We just forgot how to read his language." He spoke for 20 minutes, telling the story of Malcolm Patterson, of the tractor bought for $10, of the evidence that had been waiting 30 years for someone to find it. When he finished, the sanctuary was silent. Then slowly, the entire congregation rose to their feet, applauding not for Thomas, but for the truth he'd helped uncover. The months that followed brought changes Thomas could never have anticipated. What had started as a personal discovery had grown into something much larger, a movement of people seeking to reconcile faith and reason, to find God not in spite of science, but through it. Universities began inviting Thomas to speak, not as an expert, but as a witness to what happens when someone approaches the world with both curiosity and reverence. He always brought Malcolm's journal with him, always gave credit to the man who'd spent his life documenting what others had been too afraid to see. Television programs contacted him. Documentaries were filmed in his barn, and Malcolm Patterson's name, once known only to a few neighbors in rural Nebraska, became synonymous with a new way of thinking about the divine. But Thomas remained grounded in the simple rhythms of farm life. Each morning he still rose before dawn, made his coffee, and walked out to check on the fields. The land was producing again, not because of any miracle, but because he'd found the motivation to care for it properly. He'd hired a young man from town to help with the work, a kid named Jesse, who'd been drifting aimlessly until he heard about the tractor and the story it held. Jesse had come to visit out of curiosity and stayed because he found purpose in tending land that had become a symbol of faith renewed. Together, they planted winter wheat, repaired fences, and maintained the barn that had become an informal museum. Visitors still came, though the initial frenzy had settled into a steady stream of people genuinely seeking understanding. Thomas welcomed them all, believers and skeptics alike, letting Malcolm's work speak for itself. He'd learned that you couldn't force revelation on anyone. Truth had to be discovered personally, in the quiet moments when someone's heart was finally open enough to receive it. One winter afternoon, as snow fell softly across the fields, covering everything in pristine white, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. An elderly man emerged, moving slowly with the aid of a cane, wrapped in a heavy coat. Thomas met him at the barn door, offering to help, but the man waved him off with a gentle smile. "I can manage," he said. "I've come too far to stop now." Inside, the man removed his hat and stood for a long moment, looking at the farmal cub, at the displays of photographs and documents. His eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. "My name is Daniel Patterson," he said finally. "Malcolm was my uncle. I was just a boy when he died, but I remember him. Everyone in the family thought he was crazy, wasting his life chasing impossible theories. We didn't know about any of this." He gestured to the carefully preserved research. "After he passed, we just wanted to clear out the estate and be done with it. We sold everything, never imagining that he'd hidden his life's work inside an old tractor." Thomas poured them both coffee, and they sat together while Daniel read through his uncle's journal. The old man's hands trembled as he turned the pages, reading words written decades before by a relative he'd barely known. "He was alone," Daniel said softly. "All those years, working on something he believed was important, and none of us supported him. We thought he was wasting his time. We were wrong." Thomas placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "He wasn't alone. Not really. He had faith that someone would eventually find this and understand. That took more courage than having the support of family, and look what's happened because of his persistence. Thousands of people have found hope through his work. Your uncle's legacy is just beginning." Before Daniel left, he asked if he could donate something to the preservation of Malcolm's research. Thomas tried to refuse, but the old man insisted. "It's the least I can do," he said. "I can't give him back the years when he needed family to believe in him. But I can help make sure his work continues to reach people who need it." That donation became the foundation for something bigger. With Daniel's support and contributions from others whose lives had been changed by Malcolm's discovery, Thomas established the Patterson Foundation for Faith and Science, a non-profit dedicated to exploring the intersection of spirituality and empirical research. They funded studies, published papers, and created scholarships for students willing to ask difficult questions about meaning and purpose in a scientific age. The foundation operated out of Thomas's barn, which was renovated and expanded to include a proper research library and a small auditorium for lectures and discussions. Scientists and theologians came from around the world to study Malcolm's original documents and to contribute their own observations. What emerged was a growing body of evidence suggesting that the universe operated on principles too elegant, too precise to be accidental. The golden ratio, the Fibonacci sequence, the mathematical constants that appeared everywhere from DNA to galaxies, all pointed toward what Malcolm had called God's algorithm, a divine signature written into the fabric of reality itself. Thomas's daughter, Emily, completed her graduate degree and joined the foundation as its director of research. Working alongside scientists who'd once been skeptics, she helped document new patterns, expanding on Malcolm's original work with modern technology and methodology. Father and daughter worked side by side, united by a purpose that had seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The farm that had nearly been lost to foreclosure now thrived, not just financially, but as a center of learning and inspiration. One spring morning, as Thomas was preparing for a group of visitors, he received an unexpected phone call. It was his ex-wife, Sarah. They hadn't spoken since the divorce was finalized, the conversation awkward and stilted at first. But she'd seen a documentary about the tractor and Malcolm's research, and she wanted him to know something. "I was wrong," she said simply. "I left because I thought you were holding on to a dying dream, that the farm was just stubbornness and nostalgia. But I see now what you were really holding on to, faith, not just in God, but in the possibility that life means something. I gave up on that. You didn't." They talked for over an hour, not about reconciliation, that ship had sailed, but about forgiveness and understanding. She told him she was proud of what he'd accomplished, proud of the man he'd become through hardship. When they hung up, Thomas felt a weight lift that he hadn't even known he was carrying. Some things couldn't be restored, but they could be redeemed, transformed into something different but equally valuable. That evening, as the sun set over the Nebraska plains, Thomas walked out to the barn one more time. The farmal cub sat silent now, its work done for the day. He ran his hand along the hood, the metal cool beneath his palm, and whispered a prayer of gratitude. $10 had bought him more than a broken tractor. It had bought him purpose, hope, and a glimpse of the divine order underlying all of creation. He thought about Malcolm Patterson, about the lonely years that Farmer had spent documenting miracles no one else believed in. Malcolm had died unknown, his work hidden but not lost. It had been waiting, patient as the earth itself, for the right moment and the right person to bring it back into the light. Thomas looked up at the emerging stars, those distant points of light arranged in patterns that ancient peoples had used to navigate both sea and soul. The universe was vast and mysterious, but it wasn't random. Everywhere he looked now, he saw evidence of intention, of design, of a creator who spoke in mathematics and beauty. And he understood finally what Malcolm had known all along, that faith and evidence weren't enemies, but partners in the search for truth. As he walked back toward the farmhouse, where lights glowed warm in the windows, and his daughter waited to discuss the next day's research, Thomas smiled. The farm that had once represented failure now represented possibility. The life that had seemed over had been given new meaning, and all because he'd been willing to invest $10 in something broken, trusting that beneath the rust and silence, something valuable might still be waiting to be discovered. God worked in patterns, Malcolm had written, patterns of death and resurrection, brokenness and healing, loss and restoration. And Thomas Bennett, a farmer who'd thought his story was finished, had become living proof of that divine pattern, evidence that no life is too ordinary, no circumstance too desperate for God to write a new chapter of redemption and purpose. Thank you so much for watching this incredible journey with us. If this story touched your heart or opened your mind to new possibilities, please subscribe to our channel and hit that bell icon so you never miss another story of hope and discovery. We're building a community here of people who believe that faith and reason can walk hand in hand, that broken things can be restored, and that every life has profound meaning. Have you ever experienced a moment where you saw evidence of divine design in your own life? Maybe it was a coincidence that seemed too perfect, a pattern you couldn't explain, or a moment when everything fell into place in ways that defied logic. We'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Share them with us and with this community, because your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. What's the biggest lesson you're taking away from Thomas's story? Is it about never giving up on broken things, about staying open to discovery, about the courage it takes to share truth even when the world might mock you? Let us know in the comments. Remember, sometimes the most valuable treasures are hidden in the places everyone else has overlooked, waiting for someone brave enough to dig deeper. That someone could be you. God bless you, and we'll see you in the next video.